For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but have itching ears that will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths. As for you, always be sober-minded, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. The word of the Lord for the people of God. God is faithful. Knowing that reality and that truth should allow us to meet God's faithfulness with our own faithfulness to his mission and his work. I mentioned this the past couple of nights, but it is so true that John Piper says that God is always doing 10,000 things in your life, but you might only be aware of 3 of them. The past couple of nights, I've shared a couple of things that God is doing in your life, and this morning, I want to share that 3rd thing, and that is that God is allowing you to pursue a faithful legacy. I want you to leave this place with a desire or a renewed commitment to God based on his understanding of his undeserved faithfulness in your life. We've already talked about a faithful calling in the life of Moses and how he was called. We've talked about a faithful purpose as we looked at the life of Peter and his purpose in the early church. This morning, we're going to talk about a faithful legacy. A faithful legacy. Do I have any marathon runners in the building? If I have any, raise your hand. Have you run a marathon before? I see a couple of people here. Let me tell you, when I see people who are on the freeway with those 26.2 stickers on their cars or 13.1 stickers on their car showing me that they have run marathons, I pull up next to them and I look at them and I say, show off, because you're telling everybody that you have run a marathon. I know Pastor Frankie and I have both mentioned that we play basketball together, and my basketball days are nearly behind me. I still play once a week, and it's the only way I get cardio in each week, because I hate running. I hate running just for running's sake. I have to be able to score a basket if I'm going to be running. I can't run on treadmills. I can't run on tracks. I can't run on trails or paths. It just makes no sense to me just to run. Running just sounds so exhausting. But here's the irony. I've been sharing things about me the past couple of nights. I'm going to share with you this morning. I'm half Jamaican. And if you know anything about the Olympics, the Jamaican track and field running team is one of the best teams in the world. And specifically, they're very good at sprinting events. The Jamaicans have done very well in the Olympics. But here's the thing, there are not very many Jamaican marathon runners. Most of their success have been around sprinting events. Because here's what I love about these sprinting events, because these relay events that they do really do paint a picture of what our lives should look like. Because during the relay events, for them to be successful, here's what they have to do. They have to pass the baton to other members so that they can run their leg of the race. And I've come here to remind you this morning, New Life, when it comes to your faithful legacy, you have to remember that for the next 40 years, this cannot be a solo effort, but a team relay. You have to prepare to pass the baton to those who will carry the legacy forward for the next 40 years. That's what this text is going to teach us this morning. It's going to teach us this truth, that God shapes our legacy through our faithful actions. God shapes our legacy through our faithful actions. And he does that through us shaping a faithful legacy. Well, how is it that we can work towards shaping a faithful legacy? I think this text tells us several things about how we can go about doing that. First, it tells us that we need to be able to share good news in a bad news world. We need to be able to share good news in a bad news world. Listen to what Paul says here. He says, "For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but have itching ears and will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions." The Greek word for gospel is evangelion. It literally means good news. In the opening pages of Mark's gospel, he says, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. You have to understand, in the first century, there were many gospel accounts. These gospel accounts were written of kings in the first century. So King Herod had a gospel. King Diocletian had a gospel. Each of these gospel accounts were to announce the birth of a king or announce his victory in battle. And Mark stands up in this culture with so many different gospel accounts, and he doesn't say that the beginning of a gospel of Jesus Christ, but he says this is the beginning of the gospel, the ultimate gospel, the ultimate good news of the king who was born and the king who has had victory over sin and death. This is what Mark says, that the gospel is the ultimate expression of good news, that God himself has put on flesh. He has come to live a life that you could not live, to die the death that you could not endure, to redeem you from the curse of sin and death. That good news has changed millions of lives over the past 2,000 years. As Paul's life draws to a close, he wants to remind Timothy of the importance of sharing this good news to the people in this culture that is so full of bad news. He says to him, do the work of an evangelist. He says there's going to be a time that comes where people are going to not endure sound teaching, but have these itching ears. And they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own purposes. He has an antidote to that problem, and that antidote is share the good news, Timothy. He says to him, do the work of an evangelist. An evangelist does nothing but share the good news of the gospel, share the evangelion. They share the good news because they know that it is the only antidote to the bad news of the culture that is around them. I don't think that it's a stretch of any imagination to think that we live in a culture that is increasingly polarized. People today accumulate teachers and news sources that suit their purposes and their talking points. And people have particular appetites and diets that best suit their needs. They seek out these voices to fill those needs. But I'm here to tell you that even though people's appetites have changed, the need for the gospel has not. It is the gospel that still transforms people's lives. It is the gospel that leads to transformation in this culture. And it is the gospel, saints, that calls us to share this good news in a bad news culture. What am I saying? I'm saying we cannot be discipled more by media than we are our Messiah. We cannot allow the culture to change the good news that we are called to both share and live. The gospel is still good news. It still needs men and women like you to share it in a world that desperately needs it. That's how you leave a faithful legacy. You continue to share this good news in a culture that has a bad news world. Not only that, to shape a faithful legacy, we all need to bring others alongside us. Paul is writing this last letter of his life to one of his pupils, Timothy. He is getting ready to be executed and killed. And the last thought that he has is to think about this man who he's brought alongside of him. This text shows us two things that Paul did in his life. First of all, Paul understood this one truth that we all need to understand, that the role that he is in is an interim role. It is temporary. He knew he wouldn't be an apostle forever. And I think that's a good reminder to us all. Whatever role it is that you feel, whatever that might be, despite what it says on your business card or your placard, I'm here to tell you that your role is temporary, that you are interim in your role, and you need to be able to bring other people alongside you to carry out the work that you are doing. That's what Paul did. He mentored other people and developed those folks as future leaders. He did this in the life of Timothy. Timothy has a unique story. His grandmother and mother have a great faith that Paul commends in chapter 1, but there's somebody who is missing from the story. Timothy's father is never mentioned by Paul as pouring into him. As a matter of fact, we learned in the book of Acts that Timothy's father is actually a Greek. He's someone who does not go to synagogue. If I bring it into contemporary terms, he sits home on Sunday mornings and watches Seahawks football while grandmother and mom goes to the synagogue with Timothy. We know that his father isn't around because Timothy is not circumcised. Paul has to take Timothy to be circumcised. He mentors him into maturity. He helps develop him. Paul pours into him and mentors him for future leadership in the church. It's crazy what we call succession planning, the Bible just calls leadership. Listen to Paul's words here. He says, I am being poured out as a drink offering. So Paul says, if I'm going to be poured out, I might as well pour into someone else. One of the key markers of a faithful legacy is your ability to pour into others as you are being poured out. As your life, as you age in your life, as you're being poured out as a drink offering, you need to find someone else that you could pour into. That's what Paul does here. As you age, as you become more wise and mature, you need to pour some of that wisdom into the other people who are around you. And that starts by bringing people alongside you. Paul also says that the time of my departure, verse 6, has come. Scripture uses a few words when it talks about departure. I talked about this a couple of nights ago where Jesus is on the mountain in Matthew 17, and Luke tells us that as he's talking to Moses and Elijah, he's talking to them about his departure. The Greek word there is exodus, but Paul doesn't use that word here. Paul is a tent maker. He uses tent-making language. He uses the language that he can understand. So the language that he uses for his departure is a picture of picking up the spikes in a tent and folding it up and putting it away. In essence, Paul is saying, before my tent comes down, let me help strengthen the stakes in someone else's. Let me help them to weather the storm that I know is coming. Let me put a spike in the ground to strengthen their tents. As I'm taking my tent up, let me help solidify someone else's. That's what creating a faithful legacy looks like. As you create your faithful legacy, I want to encourage you. It's important that you bring people alongside you. Paul lived this reality. It wasn't just with Timothy either. Hans Fenzel mentions that Paul has 4 necessary relationships in his life, and I want to commend those relationships to you. He says that Paul has an upward relationship. He reports to the Jerusalem Council in the book of Acts. He's not a solo flight apostle. He reports to this Jerusalem Council about his Gentile mission. These folks are around to hold him accountable. He needed someone to report upward to. Hans Fenzel says also, you need to have a relationship that is downward. Paul pours into the life and ministry of 2 young men, specifically in Scripture, Timothy and Titus. He has a downward relationship that he pours into these young men with. You need to find some folks to pour into downward. And then Hans Fenzel says that Paul has 2 peer relationships. One is internal within the apostles' group. He has a relationship with Peter, where he can tell him things that are tough and impossible for him to hear. We see that in the book of Galatians, where Paul goes to Peter, who's being a hypocrite and sitting with the Gentiles until other Jewish people come around, and Paul says, I confronted him face to face. You need to have people that can tell you the truth even when it hurts and hold you accountable. He also had external peer relationships with Priscilla and Aquila, who weren't part of that local church in Jerusalem, but they were tent makers. They were part of his guild. They were part of his community. You need to find some folks who are outside of your internal peer group who will help tell you tough truths as well. So my question for you is, as I went through those, do you have those 4 relationships in your life? Do you have those who can hold you accountable upward? Those that you're called to pour into downward? And then those in your peer group who aren't afraid to tell you the truth because your kingdom assignment is too important. Here's what I've learned along my leadership journey, and that is that you can either build leaders or buy leaders. You can either make disciples or allow the culture around you to disciple the people who are around you. As a parent, are you allowing YouTube to disciple your children? Or are you discipling your children? What about an employer? You need to be able to disciple the folks who are around you, or in your small group, disciple those folks. If you are going to have a faithful legacy, then you need to make every effort you can to bring people alongside you in that journey, to help mentor you, to help hold you accountable, and for you to be able to pour into. A faithful legacy also includes this idea that we need to be able to choose our battles wisely. I learned this as a married man many, many years ago. When you get married, you have to learn to be able to choose your battles wisely. This is important. Listen to what Paul says here. Paul says, I have fought, verse 7, the good fight. Now, when Paul says he has fought the good fight, that supposes that there are bad fights that you can get into. The Greek word there is agon, which is where we get the word agony. Anytime that you have a fight, there's going to be some kind of pain or struggle involved, but you have to be able to determine, for the sake of your legacy, what kind of fights are good fights. Paul here distinguishes good fights from bad fights. And it's important because here's the thing. Sometimes we spend more time fighting bad fights. We don't have the energy for the good ones. And Paul recognizes that he has a very unique approach to choosing his battles wisely. And I think he keeps two things in mind that as he thinks through fighting battles in his life. The first is Paul was a man who relied on the Holy Spirit. He was guided by the Spirit of God. We see all throughout his missionary journeys that the Spirit of God is leading him, but none is more clear than his Macedonian call. Paul is having a dream one night, and there's a man in the dream who says, "Come to Macedonia." Paul has intentions to go elsewhere, but the Spirit of God tells him he needs to go to Macedonia to meet this man from the dream. He makes his way to Macedonia, and as soon as he pulls up on the beach, there's a Bible study going on the beach. But when he encounters the group on the beach, it isn't a man that he encounters. It's a young lady by the name of Lydia. Now, Paul could have said, "My dream was a man. I'm not supposed to be here right now." But he decided to proclaim the gospel to this young lady who was on the beachhead, and by doing so, it led to the establishment of the church at Philippi. And this is why we have the letter to the Philippians, because Paul was Spirit-led in his obedience to Christ. That even though the dream wasn't specific, even though he didn't see a man when he reached that beachhead, he decided to proclaim this gospel to this young lady who winds up establishing this church at Philippi. Because Paul said, if I'm going to choose my battles wisely, I have to depend on the Spirit of God and not my own power. Not only that, though, he always remembered the right hill. You know, when it comes to conflicts and battles, we all have hills that we're willing to die on. Some of our hills are as tall as Mount Rainier. We want to climb that hill just to win a fight or win a battle. And Paul says, I need us all to remember the right hill. Some hills, people of God, are not worth dying on. Paul lived this truth. He didn't die on certain hills because Jesus died on the ultimate hill on Calvary. There's only one hill you need to die on, and that is at the foot of the cross of Christ. That's why when people were fighting over food sacrifices and days of worship, Paul decided to step back because that wasn't a battle a fight that he was willing to fight and die on that hill. And Paul realized one thing, that most bad fights are just our pride on display. But here's the thing about remembering Calvary's cross. It's hard to display your pride when you see a Savior who was crucified. Remembering the right hill is a way to keep each and every one of our pride in check. It keeps us humble. Here's a question I want to ask us all. Are we spending too much time fighting bad fights and dying on the wrong hills? Let me give you 3 questions to help you determine what good fights look like. The first question you need to ask is, what am I fighting for? What is it that I'm really fighting for? Am I just fighting to be right for my pride? Or is this something that is gospel-centric? Second question is, what kind of hill is this? Is this a gospel hill or a pride hill? Do I see myself as I climb this hill, or is this a hill that is gospel-centered? And then finally, does this fight help me display the fruit of the Spirit? Does this fight exude love, peace, patience, kindness, long-suffering? Am I seeing this in this fight, or am I seeing the lust of the flesh? Am I seeing the pride of life that crops up as I'm having this fight? When you answer those three questions, it will help you to choose your battles wisely. Let me share this final exhortation on how to best pursue a faithful legacy. If you want to work toward a faithful legacy, and this is immensely important, we have to remember what we are carrying. We have to remember what we are carrying. Look at verse number 7. Paul says, I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Paul uses this racing analogy throughout his letters in the New Testament. It's one of his favorite ways of demonstrating what the Christian life looked like. We're all on this race, and Paul says here, I have finished my race. I have kept the faith. His audience would know this imagery because the Romans loved races. They loved running races, and Paul's readers and listeners would be familiar with this myth around this time of the Battle of Marathon. Have y'all heard of the Battle of Marathon? This battle was a battle in the pre-first century where this runner was said to have run from Marathon to Athens to announce a Greek victory in war. This runner had one message on his mouth. It was, we won. He was called to run from Marathon to Greece to deliver one message. We have been victorious. And legend would have it that right after he got to Greece and uttered those important words, the runner died of exhaustion. The distance between Marathon and Greece, 26 miles. This is where we get marathon races from. And this is why Pastor John does not run marathon races, because I don't want to collapse and die. But here's the greater truth in that story. This messenger was carrying a message so important that he didn't stop until he delivered it. He said to himself, if I don't deliver this message, how are they ever going to know that we won? Brothers and sisters, if you are a Christian, you carry a message too. A message so important that you cannot stop running until you delivered it. It's a message that has outlasted men and women for centuries, but points to a faithful God. That's why this Christian life is meant to be a relay race, saints, where we take the baton of the message of the gospel and pass it to others who are around us. We pass it to our family members. We pass it to our coworkers. We pass it to our friends. We even pass it to strangers. We pass it to anyone who is willing to hear the message of the gospel. A message that's so important that you cannot stop running until you deliver it. Here's what relay runners will tell you, though. They will tell you that the baton that you're carrying is just as important as the direction that you're running in. Without the baton, your running is fruitless. They could be running in the direction of the finish line, but without the baton, it's pointless because they won't have anything to pass to the next runner. New Life, Tacoma, the baton, the gospel message that you carry is just as important as the direction that you all have been running in. Celebrating 40 years in ministry tells us about the direction that you've been running in. But what I celebrate with you the most is that through 1982 to 2022, you have carried the baton of the gospel. And here's what I've come to remind you of this morning. Don't get so bogged down in the work of ministry that you forget to glance over at the object of your affection, at the gospel that you carry. It's not about the work. It's about the gospel message that you carry, this gospel baton that is worth running for, worth passing along to future generations. As you continue this life's journey, I want you to keep this question in mind. How is it that I can remember what it is that's in my hands as I run this race? Because if I remember what's in my hands, I can pass it along to someone else. And I can get that reward that Paul talks about here in verse 8. He says, henceforth, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. Paul says this reward is a crown. It's not a crown like they give away in the Roman games that is a wreath of flowers that dies and withers away. He says that this crown is imperishable. That these people run for a perishable crown, that these people run for perishable championship rings, but what I'm running for is imperishable. A crown of righteousness that is laid up for me through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And Paul says, that's how I fulfill my faithful legacy. That one day, if we are faithful to our call, if we are faithful with our purpose, and we are faithful with our legacy, the Lord will indeed reward us, not with a crown that is perishable, but a crown that is imperishable and eternal. And one day, we all pray that God will say, well done, my good and faithful servants. I want to leave you with 3 questions today that you need to ask yourself this week. Who are my 4 people? Who are the people that I have upward relationships with who can hold me accountable? Those I have downward relationships that I can help mentor. Those with who are peer relationships who can tell me the truth even when it hurts. Can you write those names down this week? And if you can, I want you to start filling in those blanks, because that's what a faithful legacy does. Second question I want you to ask this week as you're about to go through some fights, because you will. I need you to ask yourself, is this a hill worth dying for? Is this a hill worth dying on? Is this a gospel hill? Is this something that's going to produce the fruit of the Spirit or the works of the flesh? Because if it's a gospel hill, I commend you to fight forward. But if it's a pride hill, I tell you to let it go. The final question is, what's in my hand? Am I carrying this gospel baton on this relay race called life? A gospel that's important enough for me to carry and pass on to the next generation. Because it does not matter what direction I'm running in if I'm not carrying the good news to deliver to other people. 3 questions that will help you determine a faithful legacy.